Hello, class. We're covering the civil rights movement. I'm just going through the handout, okay? Your argumentative assignment. So note a few things as far as the theses that you're looking for, right? And two of them I get into causation, right? So with the civil rights movement, what helped bring the civil rights movement about, right? To try to rectify um, racial discrimination, de facto and de jure, by law and by practice in this country, right? And we've covered quite a few things, coming into this, so that you have some decent context. But so for one, right, is they call it structural history, and they look at forces larger than people as far as having an effect on the turn of events. And so, one popular interpretation to the civil rights movement, this crusade to rectify racial discrimination, right, um, is found in World War II. And so the argument is, right, and you look and find the evidence for this particular argument, whether or not you find it, convincing. Structurally, right, World War II, it helped create discourse on human rights. The Holocaust, the Nuremberg trials, Japanese treatment of prisoners of war, um, our use of atomic weaponry created discourse. Remember, even before we got involved in World War II, Winston Churchill and FDR issued the Atlantic Charter, right? And then in there they spoke about universal human rights. Going back, we've talked about liberalism, we've talked about the Enlightenment, we've talked about Christianity and notions of just war doctrine, right? And so all those kind of combined to form a set of like axioms that you don't question about what human beings ought to be entitled to. And a real big one on there was just simply freedom from fear and freedom from want. But of course, any type of tyrannical rule, anything that takes away from a human being's not only basic rights, again, going back to your war for independence, right? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, property, but also, of course, dignity was often expressed. And so, with all these factors of World War II put in there, I think it's easy to make the contention that World War II helped create public discourse on human rights. So that really became it shined a light on our hypocrisy, on our areas in which we did not practice what we preached, right? And claiming that we were the good guys against the Axis powers. And this is going to be heightened, right? By the Soviet premier of the Soviet Union challenging us directly on our treatment of, quote, people of color, saying, you guys claim, right, because we were in a geopolitical competition in the Cold War, trying to win over these quote third world countries that are trying to liberate themselves from a colonial power. And the Soviet Union was trying to court, allies into the Warsaw Pact. We're trying to make NATO allies with our contingency plans of World War III against the Soviet Union. And basically, the Soviet Union told the world, right, the premier, don't side with the U.S. Look how they treat their people of color in their own country. So that ought to be indicative of what they think of you and the people of your country. And so, though that's just another example of discourse, right? Really, really erupting and having light shed upon it about human rights. And when that light did shine, it very, very easily and emphatically illuminated areas of hypocrisy, right? So that's one way, that's one area in which the common argument that World War II helped kind of serve as a stepping stone to the civil rights movement. And then, of course, right, you have the development of a, quote, colored middle class. You find this, regardless of what your undergirding theory is, you find this as an historical pattern in early modern and modern history, and at the end of the medieval time period. Now, I'm sure going further than that, but that's kind of Eurocentric what I'm talking, but that I'm stronger in that. That's my stronger suit in my studies. But at any rate, at least there, you could find a common phenomenon in which a group of a bourgeois, remember bourgeois is people from the city, the development of like a bourgeois middle class, right? It didn't take long for that middle class to begin making demands for its own rights and gaining like a sense of entitlement. And so really like the development and the strengths of Republican form of government, of checks on monarchs, right? In particular, the strengths of parliaments are almost certainly and consistently intertwined with the fate and the existence of bourgeois classes, of middle classes developing with a new money economy and away from mercantilism and all that. I don't want to get too far off on topic here, but the point being is there very often the development of a middle class oftentimes is superseded by, not superseded, it subsequently happens, right? That they make demands for their political rights after they began doing well for themselves economically. And so, there have been sociology experiments with this, whereby they'll have people deliberately dealt with in an unjust fashion in a business-like atmosphere, and let's say like they're shortchanged money, or some minor injustice is done, and they've looked for patterns of people who were willing to say, no, I'm not going to tolerate this. I want to speak with your boss. I'm not leaving until this is rectified, etc., right? And I wish I could cite you the studies. It's been a very long time since I've studied this, but it has been on occasion cited that a pattern of those who stood up and said no to the injustice was their socioeconomic or their educational background. That, as you might guess, that the more educated they were, or the better off that they were economically, the higher their echelon in society was as far as public esteem was, the more likely they were to be intolerant of that injustice and to make a demand. And so, very, very grossly simplified, it's an enhancement to their self-esteem, to their sense of entitlement, etc. So at any rate, during World War II, after World War II, you had many people of color who had fought along with other Americans, WASP Americans in World War II, who became entitled to the GI Bill. And the GI Bill and the FHA loans, etc., helped them to become bona fide members of the middle class, homeowners in suburbia, and be able to have a subsidized college education. And so then, in addition to that, right, you have the component with education of just the curriculum and the culture of academia itself. And of course, academia prides itself on that, right? That oftentimes institutions are used, even if it wasn't their initial purpose. Eventually, oftentimes, right, in societies, institutions serve to buttress, to help support the governing authorities and the status quo, right? Those in power. And academia has prided itself, at least ever since the Enlightenment, right, on being countercultural, as encouraging deviation, if anything, encouraging questioning of authority, right? We've used the term epistemology, right? The nature and origin of knowledge, how you get to know what you know. And in academia, right, they teach the pretty much oftentimes empiricism, right, and inductive or deductive reasoning, but certainly not because an authoritative figure told me so, right? That's not your avenue to knowledge. That you question everything, right? Like Descartes said, and it begins with skepticism and so forth. And you suspend judgment. You go where the data leads you. So academia, right? You're supposed to be encouraged to critically think, to question things, right? And not take them and accept them at face value based on authority or tradition, at least, on paper, theoretically. So at any rate, some of them are going to college and they're reading things, right, that encourage that critical perspective. They're reading things on, Thoreau, on civil disobedience. They're reading about Mahatma Gandhi, right? And deconstruction, right? And in philosophy and in history, etc., and to dissect things and question them, etc. And so, at any rate, the curriculum itself, right, that you're supposed to be more of a cosmopolitan, broad-minded, critically thinking, skeptical, but in a good way, right, citizen of our republic, at least in theory, right, in the writings of like Thomas Jefferson, etc. So, at any rate, that arguably the GI Bill and the development of a black and quote brown middle class, right? It's going to equip them to demand more, to want more, and also to be able to attain more with their added resources and knowledge and collective self-esteem, etc. And when you look oftentimes, right, at a lot of the organizations, so many of the organizations in the civil rights movement were summed up by acronyms. But you look at the SNCC and the SCLC and MIO and all these different organizations, and they were very, very much at core, etc., connected to college students and college educated people, right, who kind of were at the forefront, arguably, of a lot of this this civil rights agitation, okay? And I say agitation in quotes, all right? So at any rate, so you have that to think about as far as causation. And then, of course, like the contingency of things, right? Like the whole butterfly effect. You take one factor out of history, do events turn in a different manner? Do they go in a different direction? And then you also have the option of great man and great woman history. They say, okay, what would have happened with the farm workers without Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta? You read the autobiography of Cesar Chavez. You read biographies of him, etc. You could make the argument that his personality traits, his behavior, was rather anomalous. It was out of the ordinary. The degree to which he was told by some of those in his inner circle, as well as by opposition, right, that he was a quote fanatic. You look at the personal sacrifices that he endured when he was trying to get the farm workers union established, the manner by which he won over hearts and minds and gained rapport with people in poor rural agricultural laboring communities, down from the Imperial Valley in Southern California up to at least as high as Sacramento. It's incredible. It's an incredible story. His shrewdness, oh my goodness. Talking about a good proverbial chess player. He really thought ahead very well. He took account of possible scab workers in having several methods and trying to win them over, dealing with the press and using the press to his favor, using the press and popular agitation in dealing with the the opposition of the sheriff's departments and police departments that almost consistently went against his strikes and his union in favor to the growers. And of course, the growers themselves, right? It's just amazing when you read his story. You look at Jim Farmer and Bayard Rustin and establishing CORE and getting the freedom rides established to go down into the South, right, with integrated busing. You look at Jose Angel Gutierrez, the gentleman with the glasses there in the middle with the gold brownish colored shirt. He was he, as well as Cesar Chavez. You looked at them and they looked like very, almost innocuous, studious men. But boy, the steely resolve, the shrewdness, the absolute indomitable will. I arguably would say you would have no idea just looking at them what they possessed internally until you read about them, you watch videos on them. They have great documentaries, by the way, on the Chicano movement. I want to say it's PBS, but at any rate, just take these people out of the equation, and do you have the civil rights movement? Rosa Parks really got things going, right? Obviously in Montgomery, Alabama, and refusing to give up her seat. The combination of Bob Moses and Bevel and Carmichael and Diane Nash and SNCC. You read a biography on any of them, or just read a history of SNCC itself, and you'll see how influential they were, how hardworking, how dedicated, how fearless, and how intelligent and shrewd they were. And then, of course, we haven't even mentioned Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? As far as their rhetorical skills and speaking, and their organization skills, and the list goes on and on. The Little Rock Nine making that decision to go into that newly desegregated school, and at any rate, the list goes on and on. There at the top right, you have the in North Carolina, right? The Greensboro sit-in. These were college boys, these African-American boys. And look at the employee looking down in that picture. I can't imagine his anxiety over this, sitting at a whites-only lunch counter at Woolworth's. And the first few days, they had milkshakes poured over their head, had every verbal threat and bad thing that could be possibly said to them, etc., right? They made that decision. But within a few days, it was amazing the signs that we have of popular, I would almost say popular support, certainly popular interest, and even popular empathy for them. And so then that kind of moves over to another of my four sections, right, or three or four that I have here, and that is the efficacy of different approaches to the civil rights movement, right? What really, and some people would say this is not a worthwhile topic of discourse. Some might say it's clear that it took all of them, right? But at any rate, I don't know. I thought it was interesting as far as thought-provoking a bit when I've read it from others, as far as looking at the efficacy, let's say, of nonviolent civil disobedience, right? Just go to YouTube and look up Birmingham footage, and it is just amazing how I humbly challenge you to do that and see how moving that footage is. It's incredible. And so that was a large premise, right? With those who adhered to that method, is there was a lot of optimism involved in that method, right? To the point of being romantic, is that there's hope, right? That the average human being, including white American, right, still has a degree, at least, right, of varying degrees amongst individuals, of inherent goodness. And that inherent goodness entails a capacity for shame, right? That when we do something wrong, when we see an injustice done, that we have a natural capacity to feel empathy for the victim of that injustice, right? And when we are the perpetrators of that injustice, that after the fact, when we cool down, when we have time for introspection, that we can feel ashamed of ourselves, right? And that's not an assumption that all civil rights advocates shared. Namely, right, I think of Malcolm X and thinking that this was romantically naive. But at any rate, going back to King and the leaders of SNCC, etc., right, or at least some of the leaders of SNCC, Bob Moses and others, is they contended just that, is that like right with Mahatma Gandhi, etc., right, with Jesus Christ, that you are to, there's a notion that there are civic laws, man-made laws, that sometimes adhere to a higher law, a principled law that you believe in, and sometimes they get it wrong, right? But there's always the belief that you ought to adhere to the higher law, that universal law. And of course, to King and others, right, it was the laws of God. They saw it from a religious perspective. So at any rate, the idea is, right, is that the Jim Crow laws and the laws of that were okaying racial discrimination were clearly in violation of the higher law, of the golden rule of treating others as you would want to be treated yourself. So hence, right, it was their Christian duty, it was their civic duty as Americans to defy that law, right? To make a statement and showing that no, we should not adhere to this law. It's immoral. It's wrong. It doesn't hit the mark with our notion of a higher universal human law. So not only do you do that, right, but then you know that you could largely anticipate perhaps even violent and proud opposition from authorities. For one, right, they've been socialized to just think, hey, right or wrong, laws are laws, and kind of the perhaps the false dilemma fallacy that you know, even if a law is wrong, if you began defying any law, that it's going to somehow trickle down to anarchy, right? And that's probably a poor example, but for various reasons, right? Or that people are inured, they're numbed by generations of racism being inculcated into them as children growing up, that they're kind of numb to the fact that the laws are immoral and wrong. And they've for generations, like with the Sambo image, right, going back to slavery, and depicting African American men in particular as happy-go-lucky, ignorant, animal-like, creatures of their own impulses, and not capable of being really free and having any power or responsibility given to them, childlike, etc. And so it's amazing how well we could rationalize things that we do or things that we adhere to that are wrong, that are immoral. And so the idea is at first, the person is not going to immediately say, you know what, come to think of it, this is a wrong, this is an immoral or unethical law. You go ahead and just defy it, and I'll stand by and allow that. No, right? The argument is that, of course, their initial reaction is going to be hostile, it's going to be defensive, it's going to be proud, right? But that when you don't retaliate, when you don't verbally get vicious back, when you do not resort to any type of physical rejoinder or response, right? That they have to eventually go to bed at night. And as much as they try to rationalize everything they do, they have to come to terms with the fact, whether it be a policeman, etc., right? That really, when I think about it, this guy never said anything insulting to me. He never raised a hand to me or threatened to retaliate with any type of physical violence, right? And then you see this to an extreme when it involved children in Birmingham, right? You look at the Birmingham footage again, that involved children, some as young as 6 years old, going into these whites-only stores and singing and praying, etc., right? But of course, as they're getting hit by billy clubs, dogs are being used to attack them by the police. The firemen do the proverbial hose. That's just awful to watch. And the idea is, right, is that you not only are going to eventually, hopefully, win over your oppressor by shame, but get that video camera there, get that television camera there, and make sure that it is there for the world to see. Because the hope, the part of the optimism of this movement also was that the average American was either just benignly prejudiced. And, so to think like, okay, I stereotype African Americans. I think they tend to be like this or like that. I have condescending, erroneous notions about how they'll behave in a given situation and how they really are when I haven't even met them, right? But that's not the same degree as being hatefully xenophobic, right? And where you want to outright violently attack people of that ethnic background or whatever else. So the hope is that the average American was just sort of almost benignly prejudiced, but not violently racist. And also that the average American might also be just a bit apathetic and selfish and self-centered, right? I think of the Romans using the term tending your own garden. Not worried about what the government's up to, not worried about bigger, grander crusades and themes, but just caught up in your own family, your own life, your own personal stuff, right? And so the idea is you go and sit down, right, to have your TV dinner there in the early 60s, and you turn on the television, and you see little black children getting beaten and thrown in the back of a paddy wagon, grown men attacked, and they have their hands behind their back, and they're doing nothing to retaliate. This young lady here amongst the famous Arkansas group, right? She is just simply walking through. Look at the looks on the faces of the young ladies behind her. That, a picture tells 1,000 words, is often said, right? And so at any rate, you get it on television, and you create a sense of indignation. And remember, indignation, like with religious studies and so forth, is righteous anger. It's something that people ought to be angry about. So at any rate, that's the idea with nonviolent civil disobedience. And it's hard to really try to find tangible barometers in judging how successful this was. But I tried to give it a go, right? So for one was press coverage. Is you have, as you see on number one, you have NBC having a 3-hour special, CBS with Walter Cronkite, Life magazine, right? Time magazine made Martin Luther King Jr. Man of the Year. So lots of publicity on this movement, on these sit-ins, in particular, in marches, these peaceful protests, etc., right? And boycotts, etc. And so same thing with Cesar Chavez here in California. You get movie stars get involved, senators, state assemblymen, people in the cabinet of the Kennedys and later Lyndon B. Johnson's administration. And it's just amazing the attention that they garnered. The number of riots, not riots. The number of peaceful demonstrations and protests just absolutely proliferated to a great degree in 64, in the midst of the Freedom Summer movement in Mississippi, and trying to enlist African Americans to register to vote and go to vote. It's just amazing how it kind of caught as wildfire the nation's attention, the number of copycat demonstrations that proliferated, etc., etc. And sometimes, sadly, it took the involvement and somewhat of martyrdoms of white people getting involved, right? A guy named Schwerner, of course, Mr. Peck, that you see there at the top left, who was hospitalized in the Freedom Rides, which none of them made it to their destination in Louisiana. Before one of them was famously caught on fire. People were pulled out, beaten, and attacked. In one case, they were put in jail, and the leader of the jail let them out in the middle of the night and notified the KKK to encourage them to do whatever they wanted with them. I mean, it was nasty, the violence that ensued down into the South, right? But was there a degree of truth to which, like Martin Luther King and others said, when those 4 young girls were killed in Birmingham in a church bombing in a Baptist church, said, as awful as it was, as unjust and morally disgusting as it was, that it would serve a purpose, he hoped, that their deaths would be like martyrdoms, right? And remember, in religious iconography and other things, right, with the Catholic Church and other denominations and religions, people who die for their faith, right? The idea of it winning over the hearts of people, winning, again, their sympathy, their empathy. So at any rate, so I tried to make that case in the first section and say, now, don't get me wrong, the NAACP for African Americans, LULAC for Latinos, they had some big victories, right? Like in this case here, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, it says victorious in 42 of 46 appeals to the Supreme Court. The NAACP advanced voting rights and integrated housing, transportation, public accommodations, and schools in many parts of the South. That's page 375 of this America in the 20th Century by Moss. But at any rate, so no doubt there were some big cases won in the courts. Smith versus Allwright, Shelley versus Kramer, Brown versus the Board of Education, obviously, Mitchell, Henderson, and Morgan cases on segregation and transportation, Norris, Smith, and Patton cases with black juries. The list goes on and on. And so I try to make the argument that, of course, they did a great service for the civil rights movement, but that fighting in courts never would have been enough. It never would have been sufficient. Arguably, you look at Reconstruction after the Civil War, right? And you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You had an anti-segregation law in the 1870s added by Congress. And they just were circumvented. They were worked around in the Jim Crow South when Northern troops evacuated the South, and the federal union and Congress and the Republican Party kind of gave up on Reconstruction efforts in 1877. And so the legislation was there, right? Arguably. Matter of fact, when you look at the great 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? And you look at you look at that act, it largely was created to enforce the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and Reconstruction era legislation. So having it on paper is great, but the argument is, right, is it's not enough. When you study history, right, oftentimes they go with, I want to say it was Max Weber, but don't know. At any rate, there was a sociologist that put society into 3 realms: social, political, and economic. And there's an argument that states, right, that economically or politically, like during revolutions, right, in France and Russia, etc., you could have an 180-degree turn overnight, right, with a radical new constitution, law, administration, etc. But socially, right, the way people interact, their cultural traditions, their worldview, right, and how they've been socialized as children growing up, that you can't change that overnight. So you could do anything you want for an African American in law, right? But to get someone to stop using the N-word, to stop having these xenophobic fears of African Americans making it economically, marrying your white daughter, etc., right? Those type of xenophobic, psychological reactions and habits of mind, they're not going to be undone by a law, arguably. So that was the argument of number one, right? Is that the NAACP and LULAC and other organizations, they did a great job. They fought a great crusade, but it never would have been enough. That people had to go to the streets, they had to go to the press. Sadly, perhaps, and I don't say this callously. Remember, this is just an argument that I'm throwing out there. That almost martyrs had to be made to shame America away from this, right? And so, like I said, by all means, feel free to disagree with that, okay? But I just wanted to, I thought that was a thought-provoking and sometimes, at least in old school history books, a bit of a salient thesis. So then you look here, right, on number 3, and then I take a 180 and say, well, there has to be an element of fear, right? That we're going to go over this, or we already have to a bit gone over this with a Cold War context, right? If you vilify a certain demographic, like we did with the Soviet Union, and let's say you depict them as the proverbial bully, right? The idea is that some bullies you can't shame. You could turn the other cheek. You could, you could be as Christ-like as possible, and they will just take it as weakness and just further abuse that power, that momentary power you're supposedly giving to them, and they won't ever lose a moment's sleep from having done so. And so with some demographics, right, you have to say, hey, don't break into this house. Owner owns a gun. Owner has a big dog, right? And that's what we do with the theory of deterrence, right? We did it in the 50s and in the 80s with the Soviet Union, is we actually encouraged arguably an arms race and said, hey, we're going to very conspicuously build up our military arsenal to keep you afraid of messing with us, because we don't believe we can win you over. As the proverbial bully, we think we only need to just keep you afraid of attacking us. And so likewise, right, in the domestic context, is that's what the argument I'm making on number 3, is again saying the nonviolent civil disobedience movement was limitedly effective. It got a lot of public publicity by different indicators of Gallup polls, by, I don't know if I would say turnaround of like racist congressmen and state assemblymen. There was nothing really pronounced to show like a radical change, right? Like, okay, who's okaying with this stuff, right? Seeing the Birmingham footage. Well, I'm electing him out of office. It wasn't that radical, right? But again, you could make arguments that there were indicators that leaders of this movement, like symbols like Martin Luther King, were becoming very beloved to the American public. But that there would always be a demographic of people that couldn't and would never have been reached by the Martin Luther Kings. Okay? And that demographic needed to become almost a little bit frightened into conceding change, into giving concessions to African Americans, right? And of course, the extreme of that, right, is fear of a race war, right? And so you look at the publicized occasion of the Black Panthers going to Sacramento and to protest a gun law by the state of California, and they were heavily armed, visibly, ostentatiously armed, and the television cameras got it and everything, right? People were not arguably talking about their 10-point program. They weren't talking about their babysitting and free meals and other social programs they were having to help African Americans. They weren't even talking much about their protection of African Americans against police as the policemen pulled them over in the Oakland area, etc., right? But instead they focused upon their rhetoric and saying that they were going to defend themselves by any means necessary. And there they were, toting their guns around. They would follow police squad cars, and they would have their guns visibly on them, not armed, not loaded, according to, because they were savvy with California laws. But still, right, people jumped on that fear of the Black Panthers, right? And never mind the fact that the Black Panthers did not advocate a race war. They advocated a socioeconomic war. Although they did have a lot of features to their platform that were congruent with the Black Power movement, right? Identification with Black colonized and oppressed people in Africa and everywhere else throughout the world, etc. But at any rate, another group, right, would be the Nation of Islam. With the Nation of Islam, right, they were separatist. They literally had incorporated into their religious beliefs that the white, quote, race of people had literally demonic origins. And so they were very much more in line with essentialism, looking at white people collectively in one negative way, not wanting to integrate with white America, etc. And so, of course, they were seen as a threat to a lot of conservative white Americans, right? And Malcolm X, who was just a leader of the Muslim mosque, I want to say number 7 in Harlem. He was under Elijah Muhammad, but he was so eloquent and he was so visceral and masculine. And I mean, just I would humbly challenge you to go to a YouTube and look up some speeches by Malcolm X. His oratory skills, in a different manner from those of King, were they commanded your attention. I'll say that they command your attention. His speeches, but at any rate, right, that there had to be that little bit of fear. In SNCC, right, Stokely Carmichael, when he went down into Freedom Summer and he saw that African Americans and white volunteers were being attacked in large numbers by the local Ku Klux Klan, attacked by the police, and other racist white Southerners, right? They began forming these little vigilance groups of arming themselves. Yes, they were for nonviolent civil disobedience during the day when they would go in these marches and sit-ins and pray-ins, etc., right? But a lot of them said it was a whole different thing when it came to their wife and kids, their families, and protecting them at night. And so there was a bit of a kind of a philosophical friction in their own minds and amongst one another over, okay, well, is this inconsistent? But I almost don't care if it is. I'm going to protect my family, and I'm gonna arm myself in my home at night where we sleep. And so at any rate, you see that in the person of Stokely Carmichael, especially, that type of friction or antagonism of nonviolent civil disobedient methods used, but also sort of a more of a human visceral reaction, like, hey, I will protect myself if I have to, with a gun if need be. So at any rate, the argument is that congressmen, state assemblymen, governors in the South, police forces, right, and sheriff deputies' offices, etc., that you could make the argument in certain cases that they began making concessions when they began fearing some type of a race war, when they began fearing that African Americans were going to fight back and get violent themselves. And so, again, it was meant to be thought-provoking. Tell me what you think of the thesis, okay? But I found it interesting, right, that the Senate dragged its feet. Racist white Southerners dragged their feet during the heyday of Martin Luther King and the SNCC sit-ins and all that, right? And they were getting lots of publicity and arguably gaining a lot of public sympathy. But Congress itself was dragging its feet, and with Kennedy. And then Kennedy's killed. You have a whole other man in Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson, coming in. They literally called it the Johnson treatment. He was so adept at just kind of bulldozing people into collaborating with him. That's a whole other lecture. But so you have that variable that changed for sure, the president. But you also have at that time, right, when Malcolm X makes a statement at Harvard University and says the nonviolent movement has stopped gaining steam. It had its heyday. It did what it can do, and now it's out of gas. And the majority of Americans, he said, are with me, Malcolm X, and claiming that it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. That it's that method is not going to work with all the southern states and with Congress, etc. Right? And he said basically because at that time he was having his own friction with Elijah Muhammad, that he was considering leaving the Nation of Islam, and that he was considering joining the civil rights movement, which he had kind of decried. You could like Google or YouTube Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King on his tactics. And there's an interesting amalgamation of speeches in this video that you could find on YouTube. But at any rate, now, right, this movement that he had been so kind of disdainful toward, now he said, I might join it in this speech, but he said that things might get bloody as far as the black man protecting himself, and Malcolm X in particular protecting himself. And what do you know? Right about that time, the Senate began convening over a possible civil rights bill. And so I'm just saying, I don't know, there might be other variables that have, that made those just correlate and not be the cause of the other, but it's still worth looking into. So at any rate, those are my theses on this handout, okay? What I'm looking for you to look into. So please remember, you analyze and you evaluate. You pick apart what the thesis is, maybe give me an example or two of its main supporting data, and then by all means, your personal evaluation is your own. And I say it matters not whether you agree or not with the thesis. What matters is how well you defend your agreement or disagreement with it. All right? So I hope this helps. You guys have a great Thanksgiving and take care, okay? And I'll see you next week. All right. Bye-bye.